Congrats on making it to the last talk of the day. Hopefully this will be fun for you. So my name is Lynn Fisher, and I'm really excited to be here. This is like my new thing where like if you're excited, you like shoot rainbows from your hands. So that's how I'm feeling right now. I'm an artist and designer, and I live in a great city. It's called Chandler, Arizona. So, yep. And I work remotely for a software consultancy in Richland, Washington called And Yet. And we focus on real-time web applications, node security, and community building, amongst other things that are pretty cool. I'm Lynn and Tonic on Twitter and most other places on the web, so definitely reach out and say hi. And I'm going to talk about CSS illustration, which I'm pretty into. But before I go into that in detail, I do want to give a quick summary of what we're going to talk about, though not necessarily in this order. So we're going to talk about drawing pictures in CSS, and drawing pictures in general, which means art. We're going to talk about art. We'll go over some specific CSS techniques and look at some examples. We'll ask, why are we doing this? Which you should do with pretty much everything you do, so that's a good exercise. And hopefully we'll get some good answers. And before you freak out, we are going to talk about SVG. So you can hold those questions. So people have been drawing pictures with CSS for a long time. The first major example that I remember that made an impact on me was in 2010. And David DeSandra created the opera logo in CSS. You might remember seeing this. It was really memorable because it was really, really good. It matched the logo pretty perfectly. And it was also an interesting case study because he also considered how the degradation of the logo would look from like less capable browsers. So those IEs are getting a good one there. And in the past few years, there's been a lot of really creative and impressive CSS illustrations popping up. So I wanted to look at a handful of those that really stood out to me. This is The Simpsons in CSS by Chris Paddle. This is a fun example of creating something that's already been illustrated, right? It's challenging because these are characters we recognize and are potentially really familiar with, and it's just awesome. The Avengers in CSS by Mario Maselli. And like The Simpsons, the Avengers are recognizable characters, but this one has a pretty unique style. It's kind of a minimalistic approach. I'm sure you've seen this one, Species and Pieces by Brian James. Basically, he was creating animal forms through like geometric shapes and kind of planar analysis. Lego Emmett from the Lego Movie by Rachel Bull. And this is a cool one. It's, again, a recognizable character like The Simpsons, but this time with the challenge of 3D dimensional shape. Here's a CSS mixtape by Tom Hazeldine. Sorry if I'm butchering last names. This is an illustration of kind of a familiar object, something that exists in real life, something we've potentially held in our hands in real life. And finally, this is a Zara Picken illustration, which was converted into CSS by Rosh Jutherford. And this is cool because it feels almost like an entire composition. It has, rather than just like a character or some objects, and it's representational without necessarily being realistic. And of course, there's tons of examples on CodePen. I definitely recommend going and looking. People are doing just some really cool stuff. It's really inspiring. So I'm sure you're asking, when would I ever use this? Like, is this anything that helps in the real world? And like, I build sites, I build like web apps. Like, how would I ever use this? And that is a great question. So I studied fine art in college, and I was in this program called Intermedia. And that's basically the program you get put in if you don't really know which like discipline you want to study. And so I was able to take classes in a lot of different things, like painting, sculpture, drawing, rapid prototyping, welding, a bunch of other stuff. And there was this pattern. I found that pretty much no matter what discipline you're in, the common thread between them was the purposeful study and practice of the medium that you work with. We were encouraged not only to understand the behavior of the medium, but to find ways to stretch it, to do things with oils or with wood or whatever medium you chose that no one has done or would think to do up until that point. And while these like explorations and exercises rarely yielded work that could pay the bills, it was seen as crucial in building a skills foundation and becoming a master in your chosen craft. And yet a sculptor doesn't really set out to make a wood sculpture, right? They use wood as a medium through which they communicate their ideas. They show others what the world looks like to them and how they want it to be through their eyes. And we as web designers and developers, our medium is CSS. No one sets out to write CSS. We use CSS as a medium of many to achieve our goals of making information easier to consume, tasks more enjoyable, communication more accessible, and plus the many other reasons we create software. So I want us to ask ourselves, how can we purposefully study and practice CSS? What can we do to stretch its capabilities? Like, do things with CSS that no one even thinks about doing. And for me, CSS illustration was that approach. I took that approach to better understand my medium of choice and to experiment and just see what's possible. So I started an ongoing drawing project. I called it a single div. You can view it at asingledivv.com. And I looked at it as a digital sketchbook. You know, artists carry sketchbooks with them all the time. They're constantly adding to it. So I started filling it with illustrations. And each drawing essentially would consist of one empty div and CSS. So why did I decide on one div? Well, in preparation, I was looking at a lot of examples of CSS drawings and inspecting what people were doing, and it reminded me of these artist exploratory exercises that I mentioned, and two in particular came to mind. The first was one that you do in pretty much your first painting or color theory class, and the challenge is essentially to mix all of the colors of the spectrum using only 3 tubes of paint, which is red, yellow, and blue, the primary colors. So the point is that green paint exists. You can buy a tube of green paint, but you can also create it by mixing blue and yellow. And the second exercise is creating a realistic portrait without using the color black. Painters use black as a crutch, and the challenge was not to lean on it, even though it would make mixing darker colors just way easier. But in both scenarios, you learn really quickly how much is possible with a limited toolkit, and right away, you experience the power of constraints. I've worked in an agency or consultancy setting for several years now, and I'm pretty familiar with this sentiment of imagine the cool stuff I could do if only I didn't have these tight deadlines, or if these crazy restrictive client requirements. And I totally sympathize with that. I've felt it. I get it. But it's a flawed idea. Creative solutions rarely spring from situations of great freedom. Creativity means solving problems with the resources you have, many of which will be limited by things completely outside of your control. So I was looking at these CSS drawings that people were doing, and this is what the markup looked like. So this is the Lisa Simpson drawing. And the markup drops below the bottom of this slide, but I assure you it keeps going, for 49 divs. So yeah, maybe that's an extreme example. Let's look at a different one. The Captain America illustration, which is arguably more simplistic, is made up of 10 divs. And although that's much better than 49, I thought, CSS illustration won't ever be a thing beyond experimentation if this was the markup that was required for it. It just is unacceptable. Not that it needed to be a thing beyond experimentation, but it would surely be an obstacle if we ever wanted it to be. So then I thought, how many divs is acceptable? It's 3. If you could draw this Lisa Simpson with 3 divs, would that be acceptable? Is that okay? And I don't know, but I asked myself, what if illustrations could be made with a markup that was semantic, or if not semantic, at least acceptable by our collective industry standards? And this, for icons and illustrations, this seems to be an acceptable solution. This is a pattern that we all use, a single HTML element, and in my mind, this is okay. So I decided to do that. I was going to use a single div and have no exceptions. And at the very least, it would provide a clear and challenging constraint to my experimenting by limiting my toolkit, and it would force me to look closer, to think about things differently. I'd have to overcome challenges without a crutch, without adding black paint. And in the case of every Google search I did during this project, adding black paint is adding a container div. So I just couldn't do that, and it was hard. And at best, this experiment could show CSS illustration is possible without compromising clean markup. So I wanted to go through a couple examples of illustrations that I created using only one div and CSS. So this is the first one I did. It's a camera, just div class equals camera. An iPhone battery, single div. For any Disneyland fans out there, a single div Mickey hat. A couple single div Mario illustrations, so a mushroom and a warp pipe. For fantasy nerds in the audience, a single div TARDIS and a Hobbit door. I'm a big fan of food, so got some breakfast and a fun, happy marshmallow. And these ones are fun because after the project started gaining some traffic, a lot of people kind of cried out like, oh, this is super hacky and like an abuse of what CSS was meant to do. So my response was basically like, oh, right, like CSS, you're used to style buttons and labels, right? So people had a fun time with that. And so people thought various things about the project, of course, but my main takeaway was CSS is badass. Like a lot is possible with CSS. It's pretty incredible, honestly. Like not even that long ago to create a like expandable container with rounded corners and a drop shadow, you needed to like nest 4 divs and use 4 different like raster images. It's like, I think we take that for granted, but it's really an amazing time to be a web designer. So let's talk about some of the basic techniques. And the cool thing about it is that you probably already know all of the CSS. It's probably not gonna be anything new. But we'll go over some of the basics. So a major foundation of drawing, CSS, and drawing in general are shapes. There are 3 main shape types that you're going to work with. Rectangles or squares, I consider in the same family. Circles and ellipses. And triangles or trapezoids, I consider in that same family too. There are a lot of other shape types you can draw with CSS, but I found that rectangles, circles, and triangles cover the majority of things you'll see. So here's a rectangle. Pretty basic, but you set a width, a height, and a background color. It's incredible, right? All the things you can do. You can create a circle. Circles and ellipses are something you probably already use in your interfaces. Same thing as a square, set a width, height, and a background color, and then you're adding a border radius to 50% to create a circle. Triangles are created by using border width. So in this example, the border bottom has a background color, while the left and right borders have a color of transparent. And so that 50 pixels border width is what creates the triangle shape. And if you're not sure what's happening, here's a little more clear example. So in this case, all the borders have like a border width of 20 pixels with each border having a different color. So that border top is 20 pixels solid red, and so it creates this like downward triangle. And so you have these triangles that face in different directions by using border width and transparency. And then the trapezoid is basically the same thing as a triangle, but you're giving the div a width. So this has a width of 50 pixels, and this basically removes the triangle point and gives the shape that trapezoids plateau. And while we're talking about shapes, I do want to mention that you can use border radius to create more than rounded rectangles and circles. So if we can define different values for the horizontal and vertical radii of the border of the border corner, and what we do is, what that gives us is that we can create more organic shapes. And we can also define different radii for each corner, right? So in this instance, like the top left and right corner have different radius, and so you're creating this kind of organic shape. So that opens us up to a lot of different things that we can create. So these are the basic shapes we'll use, and most of what comes next will be manipulating these shapes in different ways. And 2 properties I found most useful are box shadows and background image gradients. So box shadow, of course, the way we normally use it is to give an element a drop shadow. This creates illusion of depth, it helps with visual hierarchy, and it creates a sense of space within our designs. But box shadow also allows us to create duplicates of the same shape of varying color, size, and sharpness by using multiple box shadow values. So here, underneath that black box shadow, I'm going to add another one with a 100 pixel X offset, a 0 Y offset, and a 0 blur, and the color of yellow. Basically what that does is gives me a copy, a duplicate of the original shape, just by adding another box shadow. And then I can do it again. I can add another one. And this time I'm only going to give it a 180 pixel offset, but I'm giving it a background color blue. And I only moved it a little bit more to show the example that when you are applying multiple box shadows, think about them as layers. So the blue one comes after the yellow one, and so it's going to sit below it in the stack of layers if you think about it that way. So the top values render above the bottom values. And we can also manipulate the size of our duplicates by using spread. Spread is a value that's available to us, but we don't really use very much. And so basically spread can handle negative and positive values. So this one, this gray one, it has a negative 20 pixel spread, and so it shrinks it. But if I had like a positive 20 pixel spread, it's going to grow it. So you can make different sizes of that same shape as many times as you want. And using the gradient value of background image allows us even more options. Linear gradients can be used to create more shapes, but also to create depth. So in this example, I'm creating a cylinder out of a rectangle by using a linear gradient. So it's going gray, white, gray, black to right. And basically what that is doing is giving the rectangle a sense of curvature. But we can also use linear gradients to create color blocks and patterns. So creating hard stops between the colors will give us defined color areas. So the red stops at 20 pixels and the gray picks up at 20 pixels, and so it creates a hard line. And repeating linear gradients like you see here can create stripes. And there's a whole bunch of other patterns that you can create, which is really cool. And just like box shadows, we can declare multiple background images. So here's a basic top to bottom gradient, red to blue. And then above that, I'm going to define another linear gradient to right, which is transparent to black. And basically, just like the box shadows, the ones that you declare at the top are going to be on top of the stack if you think about these as layers. Right? So we do have to talk about pseudo elements, specifically as they relate to the single div project. So if you only use one div in the markup, you're basically afforded 3 elements. You have the div itself and its before and after pseudo elements. So here in this example, the red squares are div, and the before is the yellow one, and the blue one is the after. And so you can think about these 3 elements coming in sequence, as most use cases are, as they're intended to be. Or again, you can think about them as layers in 3-dimensional space. So I'm talking a lot about layers, so that's a key concept. But basically, you can think about these things building upon each other, as opposed to things that sit side by side to each other. And before we take a deeper look at a couple of these, I do want to talk a little bit about drawing. Like I said, I'd previously written about this kind of process that I was going through with this project, and one person actually commented that it reminded them of that like how to draw an owl joke. If you're not familiar, this is how it goes. It reads, how to draw an owl. Step 1, draw some circles. Step 2, draw the rest of the effing owl. And I laughed at this a lot, and it's right, it's totally right. And the thing is that knowing that it's possible to draw with CSS doesn't necessarily mean you know how to draw, right? This is a quote from Impressionist artist Edgar Degas. Drawing is not the same as form. It is a way of seeing form. Drawing and painting and other various forms of visual art are much more about seeing and recognizing patterns than they are about technique. So here's the most simple guide to drawing ever, hopefully a tiny bit more helpful than the how to draw an owl tutorial. Basically, everything you draw will have form, hue, and value. I'm going to go through some more simple terms because like in the world of development, form and value have very different meanings. So form refers to shape, hue refers to color, and value refers to lightness or darkness. So to simplify things, basically what we can say is that really everything has shape, color, and light. Of the 3, light is absolutely the most important to understand and to analyze. Everything looks the way it does because of light or lack thereof. I'm sure you've seen this optical illusion. There's 2 squares on there marked A and B. They're the same color of gray, but our fundamental understanding of light tricks us into believing them as different. Our brains are very highly trained to recognize the effects that light has on objects, and drawing essentially takes that understanding and purposefully applies it. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people said my single div drawings were super hacky. I'm using these CS properties to do things they were never intended to do. which is true for sure. But I do want you to think about why these properties were implemented into the spec in the first place. Most of the early applications of linear gradients and box shadows was to make buttons and other elements feel three-dimensional, to make them look touchable. And this is achieved by creating the illusion of light. The button has curvature, so it's lighter at the top than at the bottom. It has mass and dimension, so it casts a shadow. It blocks the light from passing through it. Designers wanted the illusion of depth and dimension and space in their designs before these properties existed, and these properties came into being because of that. Even though people say that skeuomorphism is over, it's still very much here. Google's material design especially centers around the concept of real material in real space with dimension, weight, and accompanying varying light sources. We're still mimicking three-dimensional space and real-to-the-touch objects on a two-dimensional canvas, which is basically what artists have been doing for centuries. So how do we apply this lesson of shape, color, and light? Let's break down a few examples. This might go quick, but you can definitely refer to these on the web after. So here's the button I showed you earlier. We're going to go through this one in detail. On the left is a photo of a button that I used as a guide. This is going to be a good example of using multiple box shadows. So we'll start with a blue circle with the main body of the button, pretty standard. And then we'll add a basic box shadow, also pretty standard. I'm using some mix-in syntax here, just to show you that that's like black with an opacity of 30%, just to make things a little bit more readable. And then we'll start to add some inset box shadows. We're gonna start to give the button some dimension and some shape. And so basically with all these shadows that we're adding, we're building up information about where the light source is and how it affects the color and the surface of the button. So here I'm adding a little bit of a darker blue. And then I'm gonna examine that shadow a little bit more. And I'm gonna add a darker color, a black at opacity of 30%. And this adds a little bit more shadow. And as I keep adding things, they're a little subtle, especially for a projector, I'm sure, so definitely look at them on the web. But subtlety is a big part of drawing, too, so I just want to have you keep that in mind. So then on the top of that darker shadow, I'm going to add a subtle white inset box shadow, which, if you can see it there on the bottom being added, right? And basically what this represents is the light that reflects back onto the surface of the object from the surface it's sitting on. Again, it's pretty subtle, but that's how you create realism in your drawings. Now let's look at the top of the button. There's a lot of light reflecting off the surface at the top, so we're going to create an inset box shadow of white at an opacity of 70%. And then we'll add another blue on top of that accentuates the button's curvature. And that's essentially where we're going to stop with the main div. That was all the div. So now we're going to use the button's pseudo elements. So we're going to use the before. We're going to create a transparent circle and place it absolutely, or however you want, on top of the original div. And this is going to be that center inlay of the button. And so we'll imply an edge with a top and bottom border. The top border is darker and the bottom border is lighter, and that's because of how the light is casting on the object. We'll give the before element a handful of box shadows too, adding to the effect of the light reflecting off the surface. I'm going to go through these, just kind of look at it. And so here, we're doing an inset box shadow to show that like really obvious reflection on the surface of the inset. And you might think that the after pseudo element will create the buttonholes, but we actually don't have to. We can use the before. And so we can create the holes by using background image and radial gradients. We talked about linear gradients before. But radial gradients, basically I'm using a radial gradient with a hard stop at 10 pixels, so it goes from gray to transparent. And basically what that's doing is creating a little gray circle in the background of my pseudo element, and then I'm going to place it at 38 pixels from the top and left. And then using multiple background images, as we talked about, I'm going to do the same thing 3 more times and place those gradients in the corners of the square to create the buttonholes. And so since we still have that after pseudo element, we haven't used it yet, we can create some threads. We can embellish our button here a little bit. So here's the after, and I'm going to use you give it a width and a height and place it at the center of the button, like before. And I'm going to create a linear gradient of like alternating blues to the left and right to create the illusion of like threads. And as you can see, there's a transparent declaration at the top and the bottom. And basically what is happening there is it's going like transparent, a bunch of blues, and then transparent. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want the gradient to span the entire width of the element, because I want to do this. I want to add another linear gradient to the bottom, same thing, but on a different axis, to create the sense of those threads crossing each other. And then really easily we'll add a transform to it, and the thread now looks like it's going through those holes. So real quick, let's go over that.
How long did it take you to create this?
That's a great question. This one in particular took me an hour. I'm going to talk about time a little bit later. So that's it. Yay. And of course, this is what the markup looks like. So in the button example, we're using box shadow mostly to simulate light and shadow. But in this next example, we're going to use it to show multiples like I talked about before. So this is the camera example that I showed you. The div is essentially the body of the camera, and then we're starting with the before, which is basically just that little like gray rectangle at the top. And after a bunch of box shadows, this is what we get. So I'm not going to go through each one, but there's a whole bunch there. And basically what we're doing is we're repeating that rectangle shape. We're stretching its size, its blur, its color, and we're basically drawing all these pieces of this camera. And again, same process for the after pseudo element. We're going to create a circle, which is that lens kind of shape in the middle, has a background color. And then we're going to add a whole bunch of circular box shadows. And this is what we get. So if we go back and forth, that lens essentially becomes all of these smaller and differently colored and blurred circle shapes. It's pretty powerful. So background layers. Background layers are the hardest, I think, to comprehend, but super powerful, using multiple background images and gradients. So this is the TARDIS illustration. I don't know how well this is looking on the projector, but basically there's lots of shapes, like rectangle shapes in this drawing, like the main body of the TARDIS. And all of those are created with background gradients. So let's start. This is the base shape. It has a width and a height and a linear gradient to bottom that creates these different alternating blues. I'm not writing out the gradients because it would be very long, but I'm just showing you like this is a linear gradient to bottom, if that makes sense. So yeah, this creates the main part and the start of those shapes. So I'm going to add another linear gradient to kind of start with the windows, basically some white and transparency. These two bottoms could be like one gradient, but when you're doing this, like you really need to be able to like chunk things out. So that was really for my sanity. And then we're going to start kind of like, framing out those windows. So we're going to add a gradient to right that handles that. And remember how we're adding all of these gradients to the top of this like layer stack of gradients, so that we're basically layering on top of the ones that came before it. Then we're going to add one more to kind of show the side of it and that middle partition. So we're going to add another one to right, and then add another one to left that does the same thing. Again, those all could be one gradient, but it's just easier to think about them in terms of layers. So here's what it looks like with the last two that I added, like separated from the parent or from the div. And so we'll just do this. Right? So as you can see, like these gradients, the horizontal ones, the from top to bottom ones are spanning the entire width of the TARDIS, but once you add these other ones on top of it, it obscures it. And so those blue shapes, they end up looking like squares, but they're really just layers on top of each other. So layers are super powerful too. And if I went too fast through those, or if you want to look at some more examples, this project is open on GitHub. Fork it, play around with it, like literally do whatever you want with it. I want to see what you come up with. So back to that original question, When would I ever use this? Is this practical? Is this a practical thing to do in my projects? And the most basic answer is no, not really. At least not in such a literal application. For icons and illustrations on the web, if you need them to be scalable vectors, definitely use SVG. That's literally what it's for. It's absolutely the way to go. I have no issue with arguing that point. But you still might be curious about how these CSS illustrations compare to SVG or even more traditional image methods, so we can go through that a little bit. So as someone asked already, after I started doing this, a lot of people were like, how long does this take you? Sometimes it came in the mean question of, wow, you must have a lot of time on your hands, huh? But honestly, it doesn't take that much longer than creating similar drawings in Illustrator. Or I do painting and illustration, and I spend weeks on things, and for some reason people don't ask me how long those take. So it's an interesting contrast here. But really, when you're drawing, deciding what to draw and the way that you're going to achieve that is the thing that takes up the most time, no matter what medium or tools you're using. Performance. So because you wouldn't really do this in real life, I haven't done super extensive performance testing, but I did on a small scale. Between SVG and CSS, and it was mostly a wash. SVG code was of similar weight as the CSS, so you're either making, if you're embedding it in the markup, you're either making your markup heavier or you're making your CSS heavier. Load times were pretty similar. If you're referencing SVG from CSS or from the markup, with an image tag, then there's obviously an additional request. Wow, sorry. But with SVG, there's also way more options for compression and optimization. So I'd be curious at large scale how this would affect performance, but I did not perform many of those myself. Browser support is pretty similar to SVG actually. IE8 and down, of course, weren't having any of it. There are a handful of CSS properties I use with varying browser support, so it's hard there. But otherwise, things worked pretty well, surprisingly, across most of the modern browsers. And so the main disadvantage of CSS illustration is the cascade. It can be super fragile, as we all know. It's hard to isolate illustrations from the cascade, pretty much impossible. And it's much easier to accidentally mess up something in CSS than it is with SVG. And yet there's value in this. There's value in this exploration. And seeing our tools in new ways and thinking about things differently. If we have an end to get to, what different means we can take to get there. Recreating a photo of a button in CSS isn't particularly useful, but the process of seeing a thing and creating it on the web absolutely is. We as web developers, we lament the concept of the pixel perfect comp, and I definitely prefer to design in browser when I can, but whether we like it or not, it's still totally common to be given a comp or a mockup that we have to work from. But we don't need to worry anymore because we have a lot of practice now looking at a thing and using our limited toolkit to make it come to life on the web. We have the experience to know that not every object or layer in a Photoshop comp translates to an element in the HTML. We can write clean markup that is acceptable to us and to the technology we use, and use CSS to make that presentable. There's benefit from stretching the tools we work with, and stretching ourselves and our own skills. And we can do more with less. CSS is awesome. I just want to reiterate that. It's super frustrating, and sometimes it can make you cry, but it's really powerful, and it's a really fun medium to work with. And I just want to take a second for us to all think about how cool it is that we can type words into a text editor, and art comes out the other side. Thank you.